It was a quiet, almost sleepy afternoon at downtown Citibank. The hum of the air conditioning and the occasional tapping of computer keys were the only sounds breaking the silence. The tellers behind the counter shuffled papers and stole glances at the clock, counting down the minutes until closing time. It wasn't that they disliked their jobs, well, most of them didn't. It was just that the day had dragged on, one mundane transaction after another. An elderly woman had come in earlier to deposit a jar of loose coins. A young man had awkwardly asked for help resetting his online banking password. Even the lunchtime rush had been uneventful, leaving everyone bored and craving some excitement. But excitement wasn't the kind of thing that typically walked into a bank. Then, the door chimed. Heads turned briefly, but most of the staff barely glanced up. At first, there was nothing unusual about the man who entered. He was tall, with slightly tousled hair, wearing a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and sneakers. If anything, he looked like someone who had wandered in by mistake, maybe on his way to a coffee shop or a hardware store. The man paused at the entrance, scanning the room. He seemed calm, almost too calm, as though he had all the time in the world. With an easy smile, he walked up to the counter. Still, no one paid him much attention. To the tellers and the few customers lingering inside, he was just another person with a banking errand. It was the kind of day where even the unusual felt ordinary until he spoke. "Hello," he said, his voice warm and friendly. The teller at the counter, a young woman named Rachel, looked up from her screen. She was new, still learning the ropes, and not yet jaded by the routine of the job. She offered him a polite smile. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her tone professional but approachable. The man leaned slightly closer, his smile widening, and said something that made her blink in surprise. "I'd like to withdraw exactly $1. For a moment, Rachel wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly. She tilted her head slightly, unsure how to respond. $1, she repeated, her voice tinged with confusion. "Yes," the man said, as though it were the most reasonable request in the world. His tone was light, almost playful, but there was something about the way he said it that made her pause. Rachel hesitated. Withdrawals weren't unusual, of course, but a single dollar? Most people came in for much larger amounts, or they used the ATM for small withdrawals. Something about the request didn't quite fit. She glanced at her coworker in the next booth, who shrugged as if to say, "Just humor him." "Sure," Rachel said, recovering her composure. "Do you have your account number or ID?" The man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek black wallet. He slid a card across the counter, and as Rachel glanced at it, her breath caught. The name on the card was unmistakable, Elon Musk. Her eyes darted back to his face, and suddenly, the pieces clicked into place. The slightly messy hair, the casual outfit, the unmistakable confidence, it really was him. The man who had launched rockets into space, revolutionized electric cars, and dreamed of colonizing Mars was standing right in front of her, asking for a single dollar. Rachel opened her mouth to speak but found herself momentarily lost for words. Should she say something? Acknowledge who he was? But before she could decide, Elon leaned in slightly, his expression still amused. "There's one condition," he added, his tone dropping just enough to make it sound like a secret. Rachel blinked again. "A condition?" "Yes," Elon said, nodding. "It's a simple one, but it's important." Rachel glanced nervously at the line forming behind him. A middle-aged man in a suit checked his watch impatiently, and a mother with a toddler in tow sighed loudly. She looked back at Elon, unsure how to handle the situation. "Okay," she said slowly, curiosity getting the better of her. "What's the condition?" Elon smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief. "I can't tell you just yet. You'll find out soon enough." By now, the other tellers had noticed the exchange. Whispers rippled through the staff as they tried to confirm if this man was really who they thought he was. Carl, the branch manager, stepped out of his office, frowning as he noticed the commotion. He was a tall, stern man in his late 40s who prided himself on running a tight ship. "What's going on here?" Carl asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Rachel glanced at him, then back at Elon, unsure how to explain. "This gentleman would like to withdraw $1, she said finally. Carl raised an eyebrow. $1? He turned to Elon, sizing him up. "Sir, is this some kind of joke? We're very busy here." Elon met Carl's gaze without flinching. "No joke," he said smoothly. "It's a legitimate request." Carl's frown deepened. He didn't like disruptions, and he certainly didn't like feeling out of control in his own branch. "Sir, if you need $1, there's an ATM right outside." Elon tilted his head slightly, as if considering Carl's suggestion. Then he shook his head. "No, I'd prefer to do this here. It's part of the process." Carl's patience was wearing thin. "What process?" he demanded. Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it up to show Carl something. Whatever it was, Carl's expression shifted instantly, from irritation to a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Let's just say," Elon said quietly, "this isn't your average transaction." Carl stared at Elon's phone, his brow furrowing. For a man who prided himself on his quick thinking, he suddenly found himself at a loss for words. The screen displayed a series of numbers and symbols, something technical, something unfamiliar. But what stood out the most was Elon's expression, calm, confident, and just a little amused. Rachel glanced between them, sensing the tension. "Sir," she ventured hesitantly, "is everything all right?" Carl straightened up, tucking his hands behind his back as if to regain control. "Everything is fine," he said briskly, though his voice wavered slightly. "But I'd like to know what exactly is going on here." Elon slipped his phone back into his pocket and gave a casual shrug. "I've made a simple request. If it's too complicated, I can always take my business elsewhere." Carl bristled. The idea of losing any customer, let alone someone like Elon Musk, didn't sit well with him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an ordinary transaction. "Rachel," Carl said, turning to the teller, "go ahead and process the request. If Mr. Musk wants $1, then let's give him $1. Rachel nodded, fumbling slightly as she typed into her computer. Her hands trembled a little, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Was this some kind of test? Was Elon Musk known for pulling stunts like this? She wasn't sure, but she didn't want to be the one to mess it up. As the system processed the withdrawal, the room grew quieter. Even the customers in line seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. Conversations hushed, and all eyes turned toward the counter. The printer whirred softly, spitting out the receipt. Rachel tore it off and handed it to Elon, along with a crisp, neatly folded dollar bill. "Here you go, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elon took the bill and inspected it carefully, holding it up to the light as if it were a rare artifact. His lips curved into a small smile. "Perfect," he said, tucking it into his pocket. Rachel exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced at Carl, who still looked skeptical but relieved that the interaction seemed to be over. "Thank you," Elon said, stepping back from the counter. But before anyone could return to their tasks, he added, "Now, let's talk about the condition." Carl froze mid-step. He turned back slowly, his jaw tightening. "What condition?" he asked, his tone clipped. Elon leaned against the counter, his relaxed posture at odds with the growing tension in the room. "I mentioned earlier that there was a condition to this withdrawal," he said. You didn't think I'd forget, did you? Carl's patience was wearing thin, but he forced a smile. And what might that be? Elon's eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and challenge. I need you to check your system. Carl frowned. Our system? Yes, Elon said, nodding. Specifically, your transaction records. Just for the past 10 minutes. Rachel's eyes widened. She glanced at Carl, whose expression darkened. Why? Carl demanded, his tone sharper now. Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone again, tapping the screen a few times. Let's just say, he said, his voice calm, I've made a few adjustments. Carl's face turned red. Adjustments? What kind of adjustments? By now, the entire staff was watching. The customers in line whispered to each other, trying to piece together what was happening. Even the security guard by the entrance shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his radio. Elon slid his phone across the counter, the screen facing upward. Carl hesitated before picking it up, his eyes scanning the display. Whatever he saw made his face pale. This can't be right, Carl stammered. It's right, Elon said casually. Go ahead. Check your system if you don't believe me. Carl motioned to Rachel. Pull up the records, he barked. Rachel hurried to comply, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The screen flickered for a moment before a series of numbers appeared. Her jaw dropped. What is this? She whispered. Carl stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the screen. The transaction logs were filled with entries, hundreds of them, all within the past few minutes. Each entry listed a withdrawal of exactly $1, and each was linked to Elon Musk's account. This is impossible, Carl muttered. It's not, Elon said, his voice cutting through the disbelief. It's a simple demonstration. I wanted to see how your system would handle a high volume of small transactions in a short period of time. Looks like it struggled a bit. Carl stared at him, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to form a response. You did this. Elon nodded. Consider it a stress test. Your system passed, mostly. But there are a few vulnerabilities you might want to address. Carl's face was a mix of anger and confusion. You can't just walk in here and... Actually, I can, Elon interrupted smoothly. And I just did. The tension in the room was palpable. Rachel glanced nervously at her co-workers, who all looked equally stunned. Carl took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Mr. Musk, he began, his voice strained, I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but this is highly irregular. Elon shrugged. Irregular, yes. Necessary. Absolutely. You see, I've been considering partnerships with financial institutions for a new project I'm working on. Let's just say this was part of the evaluation process. Carl blinked. Evaluation? For what? Elon's smile widened. All in good time, he said. But for now, I'll leave you with this, sometimes the smallest transactions reveal the biggest flaws. With that, he straightened up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Thanks for your time, he said, turning toward the door. The room was silent as he walked out, leaving everyone stunned and full of questions. The employees exchanged amused glances, barely hiding their smirks. To them, this was a bizarre, even laughable situation. A man walking into the bank and making a scene over a single dollar? Who did that? It felt more like a prank than a genuine request. Behind the counter, Rachel bit her lip, unsure how to respond. She'd already handed Elon the dollar he asked for, but the tension in the air hinted that this interaction was far from over. Meanwhile, Carl, the branch manager, had stepped forward, his stern gaze fixed on the man in the black t-shirt and jeans. Carl wasn't the type to put up with nonsense. In his 10 years managing the downtown Citibank branch, he'd seen his share of difficult customers, and he prided himself on handling them swiftly and professionally. This, however, was something new. With a polite but unmistakably patronizing tone, Carl addressed Elon directly. "I'm sorry, sir," he began, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "but if you're joking, we're quite busy right now. Perhaps you could save this for another day." The other tellers stifled chuckles, some shaking their heads. A young man in line muttered something about people wasting time, and a woman holding a toddler shifted impatiently, her expression irritated. But Elon's expression remained calm, his blue-gray eyes steady as they met Carl's. There was no embarrassment, no fluster, and no sign of backing down. "I assure you," Elon said evenly, his voice carrying just enough authority to quiet the murmurs, "I'm serious. I need that dollar in cash right now. And if you can't do it, perhaps I'll speak to someone higher up." Carl's smile faltered. The room grew quieter as the tension between the two men thickened. What had started as a mildly amusing disruption now felt like something more significant, though no one could quite put their finger on why. "Sir," Carl said, his tone losing its earlier politeness, "it's just a dollar. Why don't you withdraw it from the ATM like everyone else?" Elon tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, with deliberate calm, he leaned closer to the counter. "Because," he replied, his voice dropping just enough to make everyone strain to hear, "what happens next depends on you." The statement hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Carl's patience was thinning. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, folding his arms across his chest. Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times. Then he slid the device across the counter toward Carl, its screen glowing. "See for yourself," Elon said. Carl hesitated before picking up the phone. His brow furrowed as he read the display. A series of numbers, symbols, and charts filled the screen, none of which made immediate sense to him. "What is this?" Carl asked, his tone sharp. "Data," Elon said simply. "Real-time data on your bank's systems. Specifically, how they've been handling my transaction." Carl's expression hardened. "What are you talking about? Our systems are fine." "Are they?" Elon countered, his voice calm but challenging. "Because from what I'm seeing, they're under a bit of strain right now. Tell me, Carl, how often do you run stress tests on your network?" "Stress tests?" Carl repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Yes," Elon said, nodding. "Tests to see how your systems handle unusual activity. Like, say, hundreds of transactions happening simultaneously." Carl's face reddened as he realized what Elon was implying. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Elon interrupted, his tone firm but unthreatening. "I'm stating a fact. While we've been talking, your system has been processing an experiment of mine. Small withdrawals, very small, like the dollar I requested, but in rapid succession. Think of it as a simulation. A way to see how your bank handles a sudden, unexpected workload." Carl's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to process the information. He turned to Rachel, who was still sitting frozen at her station. "Check the logs," he barked. Rachel jumped, her hands trembling slightly as she typed into her computer. A moment later, her screen filled with rows of data. Her eyes widened as she scanned the entries. It's true," she whispered. "There are hundreds of transactions here. All for $1. All linked to Mr. Musk's account." A murmur rippled through the room as the other tellers leaned closer, trying to get a glimpse of Rachel's screen. Even the customers in line seemed to sense that something unusual was unfolding. Carl leaned over Rachel's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the logs for himself. His voice was tight when he spoke. How is this possible? It's simple, Elon said, his tone almost casual. I automated it. A few lines of code, a bit of creativity, and voila, your system gets a workout. Carl turned to face Elon, his hands clenched at his sides. You can't just come in here and mess with our systems, he snapped. Mess with them? Elon echoed, raising an eyebrow. I prefer to think of it as helping you. After all, isn't it better to find flaws in your system now, before someone else exploits them? Carl's face turned an even deeper shade of red. This is outrageous, he said. You have no right. I have every right, Elon said, his voice firm but calm. I'm a customer, remember. And as a customer, I expect a certain level of service. Part of that service includes having a secure, efficient system. Right now, your system is, well, let's just say it's not as robust as you think. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Carl looked like he was about to explode, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. What do you want, Mr. Musk? He asked, his voice tight. Elon smiled, but it wasn't a mocking smile. It was the smile of someone who knew he held all the cards. What I want, he said, is simple. I want you to acknowledge the problem and fix it. Not just for me, but for every customer who trusts this bank. Carl stared at him, his jaw clenched. He knew Elon was right, but admitting it felt like a blow to his pride. And if we don't? Carl asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elon's smile widened slightly. Then you'll have a much bigger problem on your hands, he said. Carl's heart pounded as Elon's words sank in. A much bigger problem? What did he mean by that? Was this some sort of elaborate setup? Carl didn't like the direction this was heading, but he also couldn't afford to dismiss Elon outright. After all, this was no ordinary customer. The murmurs among the customers grew louder, and Carl noticed that a few people had taken out their phones, likely recording the interaction. The last thing the bank needed was a viral video making them look incompetent or, worse, unprofessional. Carl forced a deep breath and adopted what he hoped was a calm and measured tone. Mr. Musk, while I appreciate your concern for our systems, this demonstration of yours is highly unconventional. You've put unnecessary strain on our operations, and I'll need to report this to our IT department immediately. Elon raised an eyebrow. Unnecessary strain? Interesting choice of words. If your systems can't handle a few hundred microtransactions without buckling, that sounds like a fundamental flaw, one that should concern your entire organization. Carl bristled. Our systems are secure. We've never had any major incidents. Until today, Elon interrupted smoothly. His calm demeanor only added to the growing tension. You see, Carl, I'm not here to cause trouble. On the contrary, I'm here to help. But help only works if you're willing to acknowledge there's a problem in the first place. Rachel, who was still seated at her terminal, cleared her throat nervously. Sir, she said, addressing Carl, there's something else. Carl turned sharply. What now? Rachel hesitated, her fingers trembling as she pointed to her screen. It's not just the $1 transactions. Look at this. Carl leaned over, his eyes narrowing as he examined the data. His face drained of color. The transaction logs weren't just showing a pattern of small withdrawals. There were anomalies, glitches that didn't make sense. Duplicate entries, timestamps that overlapped, and even a few errors that suggested the system had momentarily lost track of its balances. This can't be right, Carl muttered. It is, Elon said from behind him, his voice steady. And that's precisely why I'm here. Imagine if someone with malicious intent exploited these vulnerabilities. How long would it take for your customers to lose faith in your bank? Carl whipped around, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. Are you saying you did this on purpose? That you deliberately caused these errors? I revealed them, Elon corrected, his tone firm but not accusatory. The flaws were already there. I simply created a scenario where they became visible. Think of it as shining a flashlight in a dark room. You might not like what you see, but ignoring it won't make it go away. The room was utterly silent now. Even the impatient customers in line had stopped grumbling, their attention fully captured by the unfolding drama. Carl clenched his fists. He was cornered, and he knew it. As much as he wanted to dismiss Elon as an eccentric billionaire with too much time on his hands, the data on Rachel's screen told a different story. This wasn't a prank. It was a wake-up call. Finally, Carl spoke, his voice low and measured. What do you want from us, Mr. Musk? An apology? A thank you for pointing out these supposed vulnerabilities? Elon shook his head. I'm not here for recognition. I'm here to ensure that the systems people rely on every day are as strong as they can be. If that means ruffling a few feathers along the way, so be it. Carl opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Rachel gasped. Oh no, she whispered, her eyes widening as she stared at her screen. What is it now? Carl asked, his patience wearing thin. Rachel didn't answer right away. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, navigating through menus and data logs. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. The systems flagged our network as compromised. Carl's stomach dropped. Compromised. Rachel nodded, her face pale. It's triggering security protocols. We're being locked out of certain functions until the issue is resolved. A ripple of alarm spread through the staff. The tellers exchanged nervous glances, and even the security guard by the door shifted uneasily. Elon, however, looked completely unbothered. In fact, there was a hint of satisfaction in his expression. Relax, he said, holding up a hand. It's not as bad as it sounds. The system is overreacting, but that's a good thing. It means your security measures are kicking in, even if they're a little overzealous. Carl glared at him. You call this a good thing? You've effectively shut down our operations. Temporarily, Elon corrected. And only because your system wasn't prepared for the scenario I introduced. Consider it a stress test, a way to identify weaknesses before someone else does. Carl was seething now. Mr. Musk, you've put us in an incredibly difficult position. Do you have any idea how this will affect our customers? Our reputation? Of course I do, Elon replied, his tone calm but resolute. That's why I'm here to make sure you address these issues before they turn into a crisis. Would you rather find out about these vulnerabilities now, or after a cybercriminal exploits them? Carl didn't answer. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew Elon was right. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, one of the other tellers spoke up. Maybe we should contact IT, she suggested hesitantly. Carl nodded stiffly. Yes, do that. And escalate it to the highest priority. I want this resolved immediately. Rachel picked up the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. Meanwhile, Elon stepped back from the counter, his expression thoughtful. I'll leave you to it, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. But before I go, let me offer one piece of advice. Carl looked up, his expression weary but curious. Don't view this as a failure, Elon said. View it as an opportunity. Every system has flaws, no matter how advanced it is. What matters is how you respond. Will you ignore the problem, or will you rise to the challenge and fix it? With that, Elon turned and walked toward the exit, leaving a room full of stunned employees and customers in his wake. Carl watched him go, his mind racing. He wasn't sure whether to feel angry, grateful, or both. One thing was certain, though, this was a day none of them would forget. Carl's hands trembled as he scrolled through the data on his tablet. The numbers on the bank's dashboard were far from ordinary unfamiliar accounts, massive sums moving in and out in milliseconds, and what appeared to be anomalies in interest calculations. He could feel the sweat forming on his forehead as he tried to comprehend the situation. "Explain this," Carl demanded, his voice barely concealing the growing panic. Elon leaned casually against the counter, his confident grin never wavering. "That's the thing about systems, Carl. They're only as good as the people who design them. And sometimes, they're not as good as you think." Carl's face darkened. "This is a bank, Mr. Musk. We have regulations, protocols, security measures. You can't just—" "Relax," Elon interrupted, holding up a hand. "I haven't breached any regulations. All the transactions are within the rules. What you're seeing is the result of a loophole." "A loophole?" Rachel asked, her voice a mix of confusion and awe. "Yes," Elon confirmed, turning to her. "A small flaw in your system that allows for microtransactions to accumulate interest in ways that weren't intended. A single dollar becomes 2, then 3, and so on, all within seconds. Fascinating, isn't it?" Carl's mind raced. "If you knew about this loophole, why didn't you report it to us directly? Why stage this stunt? Would you have listened?" Elon countered. "Or would you have dismissed me as just another eccentric billionaire? Sometimes, the only way to get attention is to create a spectacle." Carl opened his mouth to retort but closed it again, unsure of how to respond. Deep down, he knew Elon was right. The banking world thrived on appearances, polished presentations, clean spreadsheets, and a facade of impenetrable security. A flaw like this, however small, could be catastrophic if exposed by the wrong hands. "Let me show you something else," Elon continued, pulling out his phone again. With a few swipes, he brought up a graph and held it out for Carl to see. "What am I looking at?" Carl asked, squinting at the screen. "Data," Elon replied. "Specifically, your bank's transaction flow over the last hour. Notice anything unusual?" Carl studied the graph, his frown deepening. "These spikes, they're from your transactions, aren't they?" Elon nodded. "Exactly. Now, imagine if someone with malicious intent replicated this on a larger scale. They could destabilize your entire system within minutes. Customers would lose money, accounts would go haywire, and your reputation would take a hit it might never recover from." Rachel gasped. But our system is secure. We've passed every audit, every test." "On paper," Elon said, his tone calm but firm. "But real-world scenarios are different. Threats evolve. And sometimes, the people designing the system overlook the simplest vulnerabilities." Carl's frustration boiled over. "Why are you telling us this, Musk? If this is some kind of power play." "It's not," Elon interrupted, his voice suddenly serious. "I'm not your enemy, Carl. If I were, you'd already be in deep trouble. I'm giving you a chance to fix this before someone less ethical discovers it." The room fell silent. The weight of Elon's words hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. Rachel finally broke the silence. "So, what do we do?" "First," Elon said, "you need to acknowledge the problem. Denial won't help anyone. Then, you dig into your systems line by line, protocol by protocol until you find the root cause. And most importantly, you update your security measures to prevent this from happening again." Carl rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," Elon admitted. "But nothing worth doing ever is. The question is, are you willing to put in the effort?" Before Carl could answer, Rachel's computer beeped loudly. She looked at the screen, her eyes widening. What now? Carl asked, dreading the answer. There's another transaction, Rachel said, her voice shaking. But, it's not from Mr. Musk. Carl's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Rachel pointed to the screen. Look at this. It's an external account trying to replicate the microtransactions. Someone else has found the loophole. Elon's expression darkened. That didn't take long. How is that possible? Carl demanded, his voice rising. Elon sighed. Information travels fast, Carl. All it takes is one person noticing an anomaly, and word spreads. You've got a much bigger problem now. Carl felt a wave of panic wash over him. He grabbed his tablet and began issuing commands to the IT department, instructing them to shut down all non-essential systems immediately. We need to contain this, Carl muttered, more to himself than anyone else. You do, Elon agreed. But containment is only the first step. If you don't address the root cause, this will happen again. And next time, you might not be so lucky. Carl shot him a glare. Lucky? You call this lucky? Elon met his gaze without flinching. Yes. Because I'm here to help, not hurt. But if you don't act now, the consequences will be on you. Rachel spoke up again, her voice urgent. Sir, we've isolated the external account, but there are signs of more attempts coming in. It's like someone's testing our defenses. Carl felt a chill run down his spine. How many attempts? Too many to count, Rachel replied, her voice trembling. Elon stepped forward. You need to shut down all external transactions until this is resolved. It'll be inconvenient for your customers, but it's better than the alternative. Carl hesitated. You realize the backlash we'll face if we do that? Elon shrugged. Would you rather deal with angry customers or a full-blown security breach? The room went silent again as Carl weighed his options. Finally, he made his decision. Do it, he said, his voice firm. Shut everything down. And get the cybersecurity team on this immediately. I want updates every 5 minutes. Rachel nodded and began typing furiously, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she executed the shutdown. Elon watched silently, a faint smile on his face. Despite the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. The bank was finally taking the situation seriously. As the staff scrambled to contain the issue, Carl turned to Elon. You've made your point, Musk. But why go to all this trouble? What's in it for you? Elon's smile widened. Let's just say I believe in making systems better. Whether it's electric cars, rockets, or financial institutions, there's always room for improvement. And sometimes, the best way to spark change is to shake things up a little. Carl shook his head, unsure whether to be impressed or infuriated. One thing was certain, this was a day he'd never forget. As the seconds ticked by, the room buzzed with a tense energy. Every pair of eyes was glued to a screen, their movements frantic as they tried to manage the unfolding crisis. Carl hovered behind Rachel, his presence making her typing more erratic. What's the status? Carl demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Rachel didn't look up. We've successfully isolated 3 external accounts attempting to exploit the loophole, but there's more coming in. Whoever's doing this, they're not amateurs. Carl groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. How did this spread so quickly? Elon, who had been leaning casually against the counter, interjected. Carl, you're underestimating the speed of information in the digital age. The moment your systems flagged an anomaly, it probably got picked up by external monitoring tools once used by hackers, investors, or even rival banks. Once someone got a hint of the potential, they acted. Rachel glanced up. He's right. We're seeing traffic spikes from all over. Some of these IPs are linked to known threat actors. This is bad, really bad. Carl turned to Elon, desperation seeping into his voice. Can't you do something? You created this mess. Fix it? Elon raised an eyebrow, unfazed by the accusation. First, Carl, I didn't create your flawed system. I just exposed what was already there. Second, I'm here to help, but you'll need to follow my lead. Otherwise, this whole thing could spiral out of control. Carl hesitated, his pride clashing with his need for a solution. Fine, he muttered through gritted teeth. What's your plan? Elon stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from casual to commanding. Step 1, lock down all external transactions. And I mean all. No exceptions. Carl frowned. We've already done that. Good, Elon said. Step 2, create a decoy. We need to bait the attackers into focusing on a single, fake vulnerability while your team works on patching the real one. Rachel's eyes widened. A honeypot. That's risky. If they figure it out. They won't, Elon interrupted. Not if it's convincing enough. Trust me, I've done this before. Carl crossed his arms. And step 3. Elon's grin returned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. Step 3 is where the fun begins. But let's get through the first 2 steps before we worry about that. Rachel turned to Carl. Sir, he's making sense. We're barely holding things together as it is. If we don't distract them, they'll overwhelm us. Carl sighed heavily, nodding in reluctant agreement. Fine. Do it. But if this backfires, it's on you, Musk. Elon clapped his hands together. That's the spirit. Now, let's get to work. The bank's cybersecurity team scrambled to create the honeypot, a fabricated set of data and systems designed to lure attackers into a controlled environment. Elon monitored their progress closely, offering suggestions and tweaking configurations. Despite the urgency, his calm demeanor had a strangely reassuring effect on the team. Meanwhile, Rachel worked tirelessly to monitor the real systems, her eyes darting between multiple screens. The honeypot is live, she announced. Now we wait. Elon nodded approvingly. Perfect. Let's see if they take the bait. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, one by one, the incoming attacks began to shift toward the honeypot. The decoy was working. They're falling for it, Rachel said, her voice tinged with relief. Of course they are, Elon replied. Greed makes people predictable. Carl watched the activity on the monitors, a mixture of awe and disbelief on his face. I can't believe this is actually working. Don't get too comfortable, Elon warned. This is just a temporary fix. The real work starts now. As the team focused on patching the loophole, Elon pulled Carl aside. There's something else you need to consider. Carl frowned. What now? This situation didn't happen in a vacuum, Elon said. Your bank's vulnerabilities didn't appear overnight. Someone in your organization either missed the signs or ignored them. Carl's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting an inside job? I'm suggesting you keep an open mind, Elon replied. Sometimes, the biggest threats come from within. Carl felt a chill run down his spine. The thought of an insider betraying the bank was almost too much to bear. But deep down, he knew Elon was right. He resolved to investigate further, once the immediate crisis was under control. Hours passed, but the team's efforts began to pay off. The loophole was patched, the attackers were routed to the honeypot, and the bank's systems were stabilizing. A sense of cautious optimism filled the air. Rachel turned to Carl, a tired but triumphant smile on her face. We did it. The system is secure. Carl let out a long breath, the weight of the day finally lifting. Good work, everyone. Elon clapped him on the shoulder. See? That wasn't so bad. Carl shot him a look. Not bad. This was a nightmare. Elon chuckled. Nightmares are just problems you haven't solved yet. Rachel spoke up. Mr. Musk, why did you really do this? You didn't have to come here and help us. Elon's expression softened. Because the world runs on systems like yours, Rachel. If they fail, people suffer. It's not just about money, it's about trust. And trust is the one currency we can't afford to lose. For the first time that day, Carl felt a twinge of respect for the enigmatic billionaire. He still didn't fully trust him, but he couldn't deny the impact Elon had made. As Elon prepared to leave, Carl stopped him. Musk. One more thing. Elon turned, his eyebrows raised in curiosity. If there's ever another loophole like this, will you let us know directly? No theatrics. Elon grinned. Where's the fun in that? Carl groaned, but a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Just go. Elon walked out of the bank, leaving behind a team of exhausted but wiser employees. The day had been chaotic, but it had also been a wake-up call. The bank's systems were stronger now, its staff more vigilant, and its manager a little more humble. As Carl watched Elon disappear into the bustling city streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The tension in the air was palpable as Carl stood rooted to the spot, his eyes darting between Elon and the bank's chaotic monitors. His mind raced, but he couldn't find the words to respond. Elon, however, appeared completely at ease, as though the pandemonium around him were a casual backdrop to his day. Carl finally found his voice, his tone laced with frustration and confusion. A test? You put my entire bank at risk for a test? What kind of person does that? Elon's expression remained neutral, but his gaze sharpened. A person who believes in the future, Carl. A person who understands that systems only evolve when they're forced to confront their flaws. Rachel, standing a few feet away, looked up from her monitor. Wait, are you saying you planned this entire thing? The dollar, the chaos, the attacks. Elon turned to her, his face softening slightly. Not entirely. The loophole in your system? That was real. And, unfortunately, so were the attackers. But I knew it existed long before I stepped into this building. I could have reported it quietly, but what would that have achieved? A patch? A temporary fix? No. You needed to feel the vulnerability to see how quickly trust can crumble when cracks appear. Carl's face turned red. You had no right. I had every right, Elon interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. Because what I'm offering you is bigger than this branch, bigger than this bank. I came here with a proposition. Today was my way of finding out if you're ready for it. The room fell silent. Even the frantic typing of the cybersecurity team had paused as they listened to the exchange. Carl crossed his arms, skepticism etched into every line of his face. And what exactly are you offering, Musk? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you just walked in here to make a fool out of us. Elon smirked, the mischievous glint returning to his eyes. I'm offering you the future, Carl. The chance to be part of something revolutionary. You've heard of XPay, haven't you? Rachel gasped audibly. XPay? The digital currency platform? The one everyone's been talking about. The very same, Elon said, turning to address the entire room now. XPay isn't just a digital currency. It's a global financial ecosystem designed to make transactions faster, more secure, and entirely decentralized. No middlemen, no hidden fees, and no outdated infrastructure slowing things down. But for it to work, it needs partners, banks willing to embrace innovation, to adapt and evolve. Carl's skepticism deepened. So, what? You want us to become your guinea pigs? Elon shook his head. No, Carl. I want you to become pioneers. Today's events weren't just a test of your systems, they were a test of your people. Your team showed resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to confront challenges head-on. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Rachel interjected, her curiosity outweighing her nerves. But why us? Why this branch? Surely there are bigger, more advanced banks you could work with. Elon's gaze softened as he looked at her. Because innovation doesn't always come from the biggest players. It comes from those willing to take risks, to step outside their comfort zones. And because sometimes, the best opportunities are hiding in plain sight. Carl hesitated, his defenses slowly crumbling. And if we say no? Elon shrugged nonchalantly. Then I'll take my offer elsewhere. But I think you'll say yes. Because deep down, you know the world is changing. And if you don't change with it, you'll be left behind. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Carl glanced around the room, seeing the mixture of fear, excitement, and anticipation on his team's faces. He knew Elon was right, staying stagnant wasn't an option anymore. What's the catch? Carl asked finally. No catch, Elon replied. Just a commitment. XPay needs a proving ground, a place to run pilot programs, to refine its systems. This branch would become the first in the world to integrate fully with the platform. It's a chance to lead the way, to set the standard for what banking can be in the 21st century. Carl looked at Rachel, then at the rest of his team. What do you think? Rachel spoke up, her voice steady despite the nerves she clearly felt. I think it's risky. But I also think, we'd be crazy to pass up this opportunity. One by one, the other team members nodded in agreement. Even those who had been skeptical at the start couldn't deny the allure of being part of something groundbreaking. Carl turned back to Elon, his jaw set. Fine. We're in. But if this goes sideways, Musk, it's on you. Elon grinned. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next few hours were a whirlwind. Contracts were signed, systems were linked, and the first steps toward integrating XPay into the bank's operations were taken. Elon stayed involved every step of the way, his energy infectious and his vision crystal clear. By the time the dust settled, the bank was no longer just another branch. It was a symbol of what was possible when innovation met courage. As Elon prepared to leave, Carl stopped him one last time. Musk. Why did you really pick us? Elon smiled, a hint of mystery in his expression. Because you remind me of me, Carl. Stubborn, scrappy, and just crazy enough to take a leap of faith. Don't let me down. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a team that was no longer simply managing a crisis but embracing a challenge that would redefine their future. As the echoes of Elon's footsteps faded from the bank lobby, the team stared at each other in stunned silence. The events of the past few hours felt surreal, like something out of a tech thriller rather than a typical Tuesday afternoon. Rachel was the first to break the silence. So, we're really doing this? Carl sighed, rubbing his temples. It seems like we don't have much of a choice. If we say no, we risk missing out on one of the biggest opportunities in modern banking. If we say yes, well, he gestured to the monitors still displaying erratic data. We've already seen what kind of chaos can happen when we're unprepared. One of the tellers, a young man named Aaron, raised his hand timidly. Do you think he planned this whole thing? Like, down to the dollar? The timing, the glitches, everything. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. He's Elon Musk. If anyone could pull off something this elaborate, it's him. The guy is a genius, crazy, sure, but a genius. Carl frowned. Genius or not, we're about to become ground zero for this XPay experiment. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not sure I trust him. Trust him or not, Rachel said, he's right about one thing, the world is changing. Digital currency isn't the future, it's the present. And if we don't adapt, We'll be left behind. Carl let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping. Fine. Let's start by stabilizing the systems and making sure we're prepared for whatever this integration requires. Rachel, you're in charge of coordinating with Musk's team. Aaron, I want you to focus on the cybersecurity protocols. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. As the team dispersed to their respective tasks, Carl sat down at his desk, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? Meanwhile, Elon was already en route to his next destination, seated in the back of a sleek, self-driving Tesla. He scrolled through his phone, monitoring the data streams from the bank's systems. Everything was going according to plan. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Kara, glanced at him from the front seat. How did it go? Better than expected, Elon replied, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. They're in. Kara raised an eyebrow. And if they weren't? Elon shrugged. Then I'd move on to the next branch. But I had a feeling about this one. Sometimes, the underdogs are the ones most willing to take a leap. Kara nodded, her expression unreadable. And what happens when the integration starts? You know there's going to be pushback from the traditional banks, the regulators, the whole system. Elon leaned back, his gaze fixed on the passing skyline. Let them push back. That's the beauty of XPay. It's not just a platform, it's a movement. And once the dominoes start falling, there's no stopping it. Back at the bank, Rachel was knee-deep in emails and technical documents from XPay's onboarding team. The platform was as complex as it was innovative, and the sheer scale of what they were about to undertake was daunting. Aaron poked his head into her office. Hey, you've got to see this. Rachel followed him to his desk, where he had pulled up a video feed from one of the bank's internal servers. The footage showed Elon standing at the counter earlier that day, holding up the dollar bill. But what caught Rachel's attention wasn't the bill, it was the subtle gesture Elon made with his free hand, tapping twice on the counter. What's he doing? Rachel asked, squinting at the screen. Aaron rewound the footage and slowed it down. It's some kind of signal. And look, right after he does it, the glitches in our system start. Rachel's eyes widened. You're saying he triggered it himself? The whole system crash? Aaron nodded. It's like he knew exactly how to exploit our vulnerabilities. He wasn't just testing us, he was testing himself, making sure he could pull off the integration. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the weight of realization settling over her. This isn't just about XPay. He's playing a much bigger game. Over the next few days, the bank transformed into a hive of activity. Engineers from XPay arrived to oversee the installation of new hardware and software. Training sessions were held for the staff, teaching them how to navigate the platform's interface and handle digital currency transactions. Despite the initial skepticism, excitement began to build. The possibilities that XPay offered were undeniable: instantaneous transactions, enhanced security, and the potential to reach customers in every corner of the globe. Carl, however, remained cautious. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were venturing into uncharted waters without a map. Late one night, he called Elon directly. Musk, I need to know something, Carl said, his voice tinged with frustration. Why us? Why this bank? Be honest. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Elon replied. Because you're not afraid to fail, Carl. You made mistakes today, big ones. But instead of panicking, you adapted. That's the kind of partner I need. Someone who sees failure not as the end, but as a stepping stone to success. Carl sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're asking us to take a huge risk. If this doesn't work. It will work, Elon interrupted, his tone firm. Because I don't invest in failures, Carl. I invest in people who are willing to change the world. For the first time, Carl felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Elon was right. As the integration progressed, news of the partnership spread like wildfire. The bank became the subject of media frenzy, with reporters camped outside and headlines speculating about the future of finance. Customers flooded the branch, curious to see what all the fuss was about. Rachel, now fully immersed in the project, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were on the brink of something extraordinary, and she was determined to see it through. But with great innovation came great challenges. Regulatory agencies began asking questions, rival banks launched smear campaigns, and skeptics predicted the project's failure. Through it all, Elon remained unshaken, his confidence fueling the team's resolve. And then, finally, the day came. The first official XPay transaction was processed at Downtown City Bank. It was a simple transaction, just a transfer of funds from one account to another. But it represented something far greater, the dawn of a new era in banking. As the team celebrated their success, Carl approached Rachel, a rare smile on his face. "You know, I didn't think we'd make it. But here we are." Rachel nodded, her eyes shining with excitement. "And this is just the beginning." The sound of Elon Musk's footsteps echoed through the hallway as he left Downtown City Bank, his figure disappearing from view. Inside the room, the tension hung thick in the air, and everyone stood frozen, still processing the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. The shock was palpable. Carl, once the arrogant manager who had barely given Elon a second thought, now found himself in a completely different position, reeling from the realization of what he had just witnessed. The silence felt suffocating. Carl looked around at the stunned employees, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. They had all heard about Elon Musk, the tech mogul, the visionary, the billionaire CEO of companies like Tesla and SpaceX. But no one had expected him to walk into their modest bank and turn everything upside down in a matter of minutes. No one had expected him to walk in as an ordinary customer and leave with the keys to the future of banking. The gravity of the situation hit Carl like a ton of bricks. This was no longer just a simple customer interaction. This was the beginning of something that could change everything: the future of banking, technology, and finance, all wrapped up in a single, seemingly insignificant dollar. Carl opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Mr. Musk, we'd be honored." Elon held up a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Save it for the press release, Carl," he said with a calm but firm tone. "For now, just remember this: innovation doesn't wait." "Neither do I." And just like that, Elon was gone, leaving behind a room full of stunned employees and an atmosphere heavy with the realization that everything was about to change. As the door closed behind Elon, Carl slowly sank into his chair, rubbing his temples as if trying to process the whirlwind of emotions crashing over him. He was still trying to grasp what had just happened. How had everything gone from business as usual to a global-scale game-changer in the blink of an eye? The sound of frantic typing from the back of the room slowly pulled Carl back into the present. Rachel, who had been monitoring the bank's systems during Elon's visit, looked up from her screen, her expression one of quiet shock. "I can't believe it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He really did it?" Carl stood up, his mind racing. "He did more than just do it. He turned our world upside down." Rachel nodded slowly, looking at the data flashing across her screen. "This isn't just a partnership, Carl. This is a revolution. If we don't keep up, we're going to get left behind." Carl paced around the room, struggling to get his thoughts in order. He had been dismissive of Elon Musk at first. He had thought of him as just another eccentric billionaire with big ideas, but this was different. Elon wasn't here to just talk about ideas. He had shown, with precise and overwhelming clarity, that he had the power to make those ideas a reality. And now Carl and his team were part of that reality, whether they liked it or not. "You're right," Carl muttered. We have no choice but to adapt. We've already signed the deal. We're committed now. Rachel turned to him, her face filled with a mixture of excitement and concern. But we can't do this halfway. We need to fully commit to this. XPay isn't just a new platform. It's a completely different way of thinking about money, transactions, and how we interact with the world's economy. It's not going to be easy, but it could be the key to staying relevant. Carl sat back down at his desk, staring blankly at the empty chair across from him. Do you think we're ready for this? Rachel smiled, though it was a tired smile, worn from the intensity of the day. We'd better be. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, training sessions, and sleepless nights. The bank's staff worked tirelessly to integrate XPay into their operations, learning the ins and outs of the new system while also dealing with the inevitable challenges that came with such a major change. At times, it felt like they were drowning in a sea of new protocols, systems, and regulations. But they kept pushing forward. The future of their bank and, it seemed, the future of finance itself depended on it. Carl's role as manager had changed drastically. Where he had once been content to oversee daily operations and handle routine tasks, he was now at the forefront of a revolution. Every decision he made felt heavy with consequence. He had to navigate not only the technical aspects of integrating a global digital currency but also the pressures of dealing with skeptical customers, anxious employees, and wary regulatory bodies. The regulators, in particular, proved to be a major challenge. They were cautious, questioning the legality and security of the XPay platform. Some even went so far as to warn Carl that he could face consequences for allowing such an untested system to be used in the bank. But Carl wasn't the same person he had been when Elon Musk first walked through the door. He had learned quickly that when faced with innovation, you either embraced it or risked being left behind. And he wasn't about to let that happen. With every passing day, more and more customers began to embrace XPay, drawn in by its promises of faster, more secure transactions and lower fees. The once skeptical employees found themselves rallying behind the new system, their doubts replaced by excitement and optimism. They could see it, the future was now, and it was in their hands. Carl couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he walked through the bank's newly upgraded branches, seeing the staff work with confidence as they helped customers navigate the new platform. He had witnessed firsthand the transformation from uncertainty to empowerment. The team had come together, united in their resolve to adapt and succeed. But it wasn't just about the technology. It was about the people. Elon Musk had given them a chance to be part of something greater than themselves, something that could change the world. And in the process, he had forced them to confront their own fears and limitations. It wasn't just the bank that had been transformed, it was the people within it. One day, not long after the final stages of the integration were complete, Carl received an unexpected visitor. It was one of the regulators who had been questioning the legality of XPay. Carl had braced himself for a confrontation, but what he didn't expect was the look of admiration in the regulator's eyes. "I came to apologize," the regulator said, extending his hand. "I didn't believe in this at first, but I can see now that you were right to take the risk. XPay is the future." Carl shook the man's hand, surprised but pleased. "It's not about being right," he said. "It's about moving forward. If you're not willing to take a leap of faith, you'll get left behind." Months passed, and the bank's reputation grew as the first institution to fully integrate XPay. The decision to partner with Elon Musk had proved to be a masterstroke. Not only had it secured the bank's future, but it had also positioned Carl and his team as pioneers in the world of digital finance. As Carl sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the latest batch of transactions, he thought back to that fateful day when Elon had walked in with that $1. At the time, it had seemed like an impossible, even ridiculous request. But now, in the quiet of his office, Carl realized that it had been more than a transaction. It had been a challenge to embrace the future, to step into the unknown, and to trust in the power of innovation. And in the end, they had done just that. They had faced their fears, embraced the unknown, and come out on the other side stronger, more resilient, and ready for whatever the future had in store. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Carl smiled to himself. The future wasn't just coming, it was here. And they were ready. The automatic doors of downtown Citibank slid closed behind Elon Musk with a soft whoosh, and as he turned to walk down the street, a small smile spread across his face. He could feel the weight of the day's events, the quiet revolution he had started, the challenges he had thrown at Carl and his team, and the ripple effect that was already starting to spread across the world. But beyond all of that, Elon understood something simple and profound: sometimes, the smallest actions spark the biggest changes. It wasn't the huge, grand gestures that changed the world. No, it was the little moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at first, that often had the most profound impact. A single dollar, handed over to a skeptical bank manager, had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the way the world thought about money, about technology, and about the very idea of progress itself. As Elon continued walking, his mind drifted back to those first few moments inside the bank. He had walked in just like any other customer, no fanfare, no grand introduction. Just him, a simple request, and a test of a system that he knew had the potential to either evolve or collapse. It hadn't been about the dollar itself, or even about Carl's resistance. It had been about something far more important: the willingness to change. And it wasn't just about Carl. It was about everyone who had stood there that day, about the employees who had watched in disbelief, the customers who had unknowingly witnessed the beginning of something new, and the world at large that had no idea what was coming. In the end, the most important question wasn't whether Carl and his team would embrace the future, it was whether they would have the courage to take that first step. Elon smiled again, this time with more satisfaction. In every challenge, in every seemingly impossible task, there was an opportunity for growth. That was what he wanted to show them, and that was what he had proved. The future wasn't something you waited for. It was something you created, piece by piece, decision by decision, action by action. He could hear the city around him, the hum of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant sound of sirens. It was the sound of life going on as usual. But deep down, he knew that something had changed. The spark had been lit. The next step was inevitable. Elon thought about the phrase he had told Carl in the bank, the one that had felt so right in the moment: innovation doesn't wait. Neither do I. It was a simple truth, yet one that was too often ignored. So many people waited for things to change, waited for others to lead the way. But by the time you waited for permission, you'd already missed the moment. And those who underestimated the power of the unexpected? They were the ones who would be left behind. People like Carl and his team had learned that lesson the hard way. They had seen, firsthand, that you couldn't just go through the motions and expect the world to change around you. You had to take risks, push boundaries, and be ready for the unexpected. Only then could you truly make an impact. Elon's footsteps quickened as he walked toward his car, his thoughts still racing. In a way, the events of the day were just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, of course. The integration of XPay into the world's financial systems would not be easy. There would be skeptics, roadblocks, and plenty of people who didn't want things to change. But that was all part of the journey. What mattered was that the idea was out there now. People had seen what could happen when you took a leap of faith. They had witnessed how a single small moment could alter the course of history. And no matter how hard people tried to ignore it or resist it, the truth would remain: the future had arrived. As Elon reached his car and slid into the driver's seat, he took a deep breath, his fingers brushing the steering wheel. There was always a certain calm that came after a storm, a sense of accomplishment that followed every challenge. But he knew that this was just one of many moments, and the road ahead was full of new challenges waiting to be faced. In the silence of the car, Elon thought about the bigger picture. It wasn't just about disrupting industries or changing the way people lived. It was about something deeper. It was about inspiring people to believe in their own potential, to take risks, to step outside their comfort zones, and to create the future they wanted to see. That was the true power of innovation: to empower others to dream bigger, to push harder, and to build things that no one had ever imagined before. He thought back to the moment when he had handed over that dollar to Carl. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a small, meaningless gesture. But to him, it had been a test to see if people were truly ready to embrace change, to see if they were willing to challenge the way things had always been done. And when Carl had hesitated, when the staff had questioned him, it had been a moment of truth. The future wasn't going to wait for anyone. It was coming, whether they were ready or not. Elon looked out the window, watching the world around him. He had seen it all: the doubt, the skepticism, the fears. But he had also seen the excitement in people's eyes when they realized what was possible. The future wasn't something that would just appear one day. It was something you built, step by step, choice by choice. And it wasn't about waiting for permission. It was about taking that first step, no matter how small it seemed, and trusting that the rest would follow. Elon turned the key in the ignition and drove off into the city, his mind already racing with the next challenge, the next opportunity. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but that was what made it worth taking. Every obstacle, every setback, every failure was just another step towards something greater. And he was ready for whatever came next. Because when you understood that the future was in your hands, that it wasn't some distant, unreachable thing, you realized that the only limit was the one you set for yourself. And Elon Musk wasn't about to let anything hold him back. He smiled to himself, the thought lingering in his mind: the best way to predict the future was to create it. And that was exactly what he intended to do. As the city lights blurred past him, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. Not because everything was finished, but because everything was just beginning. And in that moment, Elon Musk understood the greatest truth of all: the power to shape the future was not reserved for a select few. It was for anyone who dared to dream, to act, and to believe in the impossible. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful lesson of all.